In post-mission debriefing, Scott recommended that future crews be woken at once under similar circumstances. ALSJ-10. After donning their suits and depressurizing the cabin, ALSJ-11, Scott and Irwin began their first full EVA, becoming the 7th and 8th humans, respectively, to walk on the Moon. They began deploying the Lunar Rover, stored folded up in a compartment of Falcon's descent stage, but this proved troublesome due to the slant of the lander. Scott said, "Okay, out of detent, we're maneuvering the rover away from Falcon in mid-sentence." The resolution was not high compared to the still photographs that would be taken, but the camera allowed the geologists on Earth to indirectly participate in Scott and Irwin's activities. The rill was not visible from the landing site, but as Scott and Irwin drove over the rolling terrain, it came into view. ALSJ-12, reaching Elbow, a known location, allowed mission control to backtrack and get closer to pinpointing the location of the lander. After concluding this stop, they returned to the lander to drop off their samples and prepare to set up the Apollo Lunar Surface Experiments package, the scientific instruments that would remain when they left. Scott had difficulty drilling the holes required for the heat flow experiment, and the work was not completed when they had to return to the lander. The rover's front steering, inoperative during the first EVA, worked during the second and third ones. The target of the second EVA, on August 1st, was the slope of Mons Hadley Delta, where the pair sampled boulders in craters along the Apennine front. This rock, an anorthosite, is believed to be part of the early lunar crust. The hope of finding such a specimen had been one reason the Hadley area had been chosen. Once back at the landing site, Scott continued to try to drill holes for experiments at the ALSEP site, with which he had struggled the day before. After conducting soil mechanics experiments and raising the US flag, Scott and Irwin returned to the LM. EVA 2 lasted 7 hours and 12 minutes. ALSJ-6. Although Scott had eventually been successful at drilling the holes, he and Irwin had been unable to retrieve a core sample, and this was an early order of business during EVA 3, their third and final moonwalk. Time that could have been devoted to geology ticked away as Scott and Irwin attempted to pull it out. Once it had been retrieved, more time passed as they attempted to break the core into pieces for transport to Earth. Scott wondered if the core was worth the amount of time and effort invested, and the Capcom, Joe Allen, assured him it was. The core proved one of the most important items brought back from the Moon, revealing much about its history, but the expended time meant the planned visit to a group of hills known as the North Complex had to be scrubbed. Instead, the crew again ventured to the edge of Hadley Rill, this time to the northwest of the immediate landing site. ALSJ-6. Once the astronauts were beside the LM, Scott used a kit provided by the Postal Service to cancel a first-day cover of 2 stamps being issued on August 2nd, the current date. ALSJ-3. Scott then performed an experiment in view of the television camera, using a falcon feather and hammer to demonstrate Galileo's theory that all objects in a given gravity field fall at the same rate, regardless of mass, in the absence of aerodynamic drag. He dropped the hammer and feather at the same time. Because of the negligible lunar atmosphere, there was no drag on the feather, which hit the ground at the same time as the hammer. ALSJ-3. Scott then drove the rover to a position away from the LM, where the television camera could be used to observe the lunar liftoff. Near the rover, he left a small aluminum statuette called Fallen Astronaut, along with a plaque bearing the names of 14 known American astronauts and Soviet cosmonauts who had died in the furtherance of space exploration. The memorial was left while the television camera was turned away. He told Mission Control he was doing some cleanup activities around the rover. Scott disclosed the memorial in a post-flight news conference. He also placed a Bible on the control panel of the rover before leaving it for the last time to enter the LM. ALSJ-3. The EVA lasted 4 hours, 49 minutes and 50 seconds. In total, the 2 astronauts spent 181 halves of an hour outside the LM and collected approximately 170 pounds of lunar samples. ALSJ-6. After the departure of Falcon, Worden and Endeavour executed a burn to take the CSM to a higher orbit. ALFJ-13. While Falcon was on the Moon, the mission effectively split, Worden and the CSM being assigned their own Capcom and flight support team. ALFJ-14. Worden got busy with the tasks that were to occupy him for much of the time he spent in space alone, photography and operating the instruments in the sim bay. ALFJ-14. The door to the sim bay had been explosively jettisoned during the translunar coast. Filling previously unused space in the service module, the sim bay contained a gamma-ray spectrometer, mounted on the end of a boom, an X-ray spectrometer and a laser altimeter, which failed part-way through the mission. two cameras, a stellar camera and a metric camera, together comprised the mapping camera, which was complemented by a panoramic camera, derived from SPY technology. The altimeter and cameras permitted the exact time and location from which pictures were taken to be determined. Also present were an alpha particle spectrometer, which could be used to detect evidence of lunar volcanism, and a mass spectrometer, also on a boom in the hope it would be unaffected by contamination from the ship. The boom would prove troublesome, as Worden would not always be able to get it to retract. ALFJ-8, Endeavour was slated to pass over the landing site at the moment of planned landing, ALFJ-13, but Worden could not see Falcon, ALSJ-7, and did not spot it until a subsequent orbit. He also exercised to avoid muscle atrophy, and Houston kept him up to date on Scott and Irwin's activities on the lunar surface. The panoramic camera did not operate perfectly, but provided enough images that no special adjustment was made. Worden took many photographs through the command module's windows, often with shots taken at regular intervals. His task was complicated by the lack of a working mission timer in the lower equipment bay of the command module, as its circuit breaker had popped en route to the moon. ALFJ-14, Worden's observations and photographs would inform the decision to send Apollo 17 to Taurus Littrow to search for evidence of volcanic activity. There was a communications blackout when the CSM passed over the far side of the moon from Earth. Worden greeted each resumption of contact with the words, "Hello, Earth." Greetings from Endeavour, expressed in different languages. Worden and El-Baz had come up with the idea, and the geology instructor had aided the astronaut in accumulating translations. ALFJ-15. Results from the Sim Bay experiments would include the conclusion, from data gathered by the X-ray spectrometer, that there was greater fluorescent X-ray flux than anticipated, and that the lunar highlands were richer in aluminum than were the mares. Endeavour was in a more inclined orbit than previous crewed missions, and Worden saw features that were not known previously, supplementing photographs with thorough descriptions. By the time Scott and Irwin were ready to take off from the lunar surface and return to Endeavour, the CSM's orbit had drifted due to the rotation of the moon, and a plane change burn was required to ensure that the CSM's orbit would be in the same plane as that of the LM once it took off from the moon. Worden accomplished the 18-second burn with the SPS, ALFJ-16. Falcon lifted off the moon at 17 hours 11 minutes and 22 seconds Greenwich Mean Time on August 2 after 66 hours and 55 minutes on the lunar surface. After the astronauts transferred samples and other items from the LM to the CSM, the LM was sealed off, jettisoned, and intentionally crashed into the lunar surface, an impact registered by the seismometers left by Apollo 12, 14 and 15. ALFJ-2. The jettison proved difficult because of problems getting airtight seals, requiring a delay in discarding the LM. After the jettison, Slayton came on the loop to recommend the astronauts take sleeping pills, or at least that Scott and Irwin do so. Scott as mission commander refused to allow it, feeling there was no need. During the AVAs, the doctors had noticed irregularities in both Scott's and Irwin's heartbeats, but the crew were not informed during the flight.